Back in the early days of WoW, Flasks were thought to be very powerful, and as such, there was a barrier to entry when it came to crafting them. This is where alchemy labs come into play, and you needed to be near an alchemy lab to create a flask, and a few other items. In very early vanilla WoW, there was only one alchemy lab in the game, and it was not in a convenient location. I mean, putting a thing vital to making a very commonly used raid buff in a major city or something would make too much sense for vanilla WoW. Well, flasks are commonly used today anyway, so I guess it wasn't as super important back then. But the only alchemy lab was located in the laboratory in the Scholomance dungeon. Scholomance in vanilla WoW was a nearly max level dungeon, and the alchemy lab was tucked away in a room that required a key to enter, in addition to the key required to get into the dungeon in the first place. Because did I mention you needed a specific key to get in? Anyways, once you could actually get inside the dungeon, you only really needed to kill one boss to get a key to the viewing room, and then you could get into the laboratory. So this required killing at least one boss and a few choice trash pulls if you were very sneaky about hugging walls to avoid them. You also definitely needed to get a group together, as you could not solo this. But luckily, a little later on in vanilla WoW, they added a second alchemy lab to the game. This one in a raid. Just like the one in Scholomance, this one was not convenient to get to. It was located right behind the third boss of Blackwing Lair, who was the boss at the end of the infamous suppression room, in a raid famous for having the hardest first two bosses of any raid ever in the history of the game. So yeah, they did eventually add another lab, but they could not have put it in a worse spot if they had tried. And those were the only two alchemy labs in the game until the Burning Crusade came out. So with the launch of the new expansion, the lab was located in, surprisingly, a convenient location, right next to the alchemy trainers in Shattrath, a neutral major city that everyone hanged out at. And as you might expect, with this alchemy lab, no one ever went back to the other two, despite them being a little easier to get to now with the new level increase. They even added a fourth lab in the Isle of Quel'Danas, another neutral location not located inside a dungeon. Then in Wrath of the Lich King, Blizzard continued its madness of adding an alchemy lab in a convenient location, and placed one inside the Ebon Hold. Well, convenient for Death Knights anyway. But that didn't really matter, because very early on in Wrath, Blizzard just straight up removed the alchemy lab requirement from making flasks, essentially making them obsolete. Over time, Blizzard kind of brought flasks more in line and gave them some adjustments. It used to be they acted as magical effects and could be stacked like any old buffs, but then they were made undispellable and changed to no longer stack. They were also given the much needed persist through death mechanic they have today, mid-vanilla WoW. Then after no major changes until Wrath, they just kind of removed the alchemy lab requirement to make them, and then a patch later, upped their durations to 1 hour. Blizzard was really pushing the Flask as the raid consumable buff in this expansion, with the nerfs to elixirs no longer allowing them to stack as well, and making them not usable with flasks eventually too. The only things that required alchemy labs were the Philosopher's Stones, and this one item called the Mercurial Stone. So, things you only really had to craft one time, and totally fine with the location requirement to create. Then, after removing flasks from alchemy labs, Blizzard didn't actually add anything else that needed a lab to make, and kind of phased it out. In Warlords of Draenor, the alchemy building you can place in your garrison is called the Alchemy Lab, and despite its name, doesn't actually count as an alchemy lab. In Legion, with all the changes to professions and quest chains for them, they added location requirements for a lot of the potions and flasks to be at the Dalaran Alchemy Station. But as you got higher ranks of the crafts, you no longer need to create them at the station, and can just make them anywhere like all other alchemy crafts, which I thought was a neat little nod to old school alchemy labs. And as far as alchemy labs go, that's it. There were obviously a lot more changes to alchemy as a whole over the years, and labs were just kind of a small part of it.